I am a traditionalist in that I hold to a conservative, traditional Judeo-Christian viewpoint on marriage and sexuality and family. I am assuming, I think logically, that most people attending here are also traditionalists, although I know anytime you throw out a label, you're going to have some problems with the limitations. But I think essentially we would be on the same page regarding these things. At least most people who come to such an event are. As you know, I'll overstate the obvious here, the cultural shift on this issue has been astonishing, both in its breadth and in its speed. And as a result, we are finding ourselves more and more as traditionalists dealing with foundational differences in thought and approach with those in the culture. And that often either inhibits or colors our interactions with people with a good deal of tension. So we are dealing with differences. And when we are dealing with differences, that is to an extent emotionally taxing if the people we have differences with are not very close to us. I find apologetics, for example, not simple, but emotionally not very draining when I'm discussing, I don't know, the divinity of Christ or the authority of the Bible or the existence of God, to whatever extent I can intelligently discuss such things with someone who simply holds a different viewpoint. When I'm talking to a loved one, a very close friend, someone I'm deeply invested in, isn't it interesting how messy everything gets? We may know our positions very well, but the emotional ramifications surface, and oh my gosh, now we really realize there is a body, soul, spirit thing going on here when we are dealing with differences. We are, on the one hand, not wanting to dwell on our differences. Why should we? By the same token, we are wanting to be authentic. We're wanting to be respectful. Above all, we are wanting to be faithful. We are wanting to be faithful. It is inconceivable that I can love God without being faithful to God. That means fidelity to His nature, fidelity to His truth, both in the way I live, as Andy said so well, not perfect fidelity, but going that way, and certainly in the truths that I hold to. And that means, of course, I am going to engage at times with people who hold very different principles, and the difference in this area in particular is becoming not only very marked, but as you know, very vehement, very vehement. So, rules of engagement. Now, just a few points about engagement. I do not think engagement is always necessary or wise. I think generally, because God is relational, we ought also to be relational, and so I think we will, and I think we should sustain a hunger for engagement. We do want to talk. We want to exchange ideas. We want to communicate, and without apology, yeah, we want to persuade. Good heavens. If I didn't feel that these were eternal truths, I wouldn't bother with them. So naturally, when we're engaging with people, we have a hope for an outcome. And so engagement is something that we covet when we're dealing with people, but it's not always smart, is it? I'm driving down the street, somebody cuts me off, and he greets me with one of his digits. You know, I make a quick decision as to whether or not I'm even going to acknowledge that. I don't think in most cases it's very smart to even acknowledge it. I think the most I would say is, I see you have a finger, you must be very proud. There's a lot you can achieve, isn't there? And there is a place for non-acknowledgement. In fact, in Scripture, I see both Jesus and Paul at times just basically, I'm not going there. You're trying to trap me, you're trying to antagonize me, and I just have better things to do. I have bigger fish to fry. So sometimes even acknowledgement does not happen. Sometimes we limit our engagement to a response rather than what we would call real engagement, a brief response. Somebody asks a question, I offer a brief response, and that's about it, because I get a sense that this probably is not going to go anywhere redemptive, and if I take it any further, it's going to turn into a snare. Or we decide to engage. I think engagement is challenging, fascinating, fruitful. It's a great emotional and intellectual workout. I think of Paul engaging people. And it seems to me when he would be reasoning with people in the synagogues about the nature and person of Jesus Christ and about the question of the Messiah, has he come or has he not, and so forth. There is a vigorous respect going on. We are exchanging, we're hearing each other, and we're trying to reason with each other. And there is also a passion. I am hoping that you can understand this viewpoint, which I feel is so important. And there's even a level of accountability to it, because when I'm engaging with someone, I'm giving an explanation for my position. Tomorrow in our general session, I'll be talking about making our apologia, how today we find ourselves in a position of needing to make a defense for what traditionally has been assumed. So I do think engagement is a desired outcome when we are dealing with people. Normally, when we want to engage, it is because we want to give an honest expression of where we stand and what we believe. We have an earnest hope that what we say will be heard and be received. We have a secondary hope that it will at least be better understood. And that's a very beneficial outcome to an engagement. It may not be everything we want. Generally, we want conversion when we engage. We hope that the person we're engaging in will, if they are a non-believer, be converted from death to life, or if they are a believer in error, we hope they will be converted from their error to the truth. Sometimes the outcome is, well, at least they have a much better understanding of who we are and what we believe. And I'll bet you've had conversations like this before, where you are discussing, say, sexuality or current issues in the light of a biblical perspective. And the person says, well, you know, I don't really agree with you, but at least I have a better understanding of what Christians are all about. Well, okay, that's good. That's good. May not be all you want, but it's very good. So, when we engage, we are concerned with what we communicate, of course, and we are concerned with how we communicate, what principles we follow. So, in the interest of more effective communication, let's look now at some rules of engagement. These rules I'm talking about are drawn from my book. Here I'll pull a shameless mercenary plug, but in the bookstore, my book, Speaking of Homosexuality, covers this material in much more length if it's something that you would be interested in. It's called Speaking of Homosexuality. All right, rules of engagement. This certainly mattered to Paul, didn't it? You remember 1 Corinthians 9:24. Know you not, those who run a race run all, only one receives the prize. Only one is going to win. That statement is based on the presumption that we are all running, and we are. We are. We are all, that is to say, on a path, a journey, and I love the fact that he frames it more than once in the New Testament in terms of an athletic event. When Paul wrote to Corinth, the athletic lifestyle was a very noble lifestyle. The Isthmian Games were taken very seriously. If you gave yourself to the rigor of training and competing, that was seen as a very virtuous thing to do, requiring a tremendous amount of stamina and self-sacrifice. So I find it interesting he uses those images to portray the Christian experience, that it is not just a passive experience by which we come into a higher knowledge or some form of a nirvana. But, and this to me is very important, it is an experience in which we realize by the grace of God we were created with purpose. God is making that unique purpose for each life clearer to us. We have a commission to fulfill that purpose by the grace of God. And a large part of that purpose will be taken up with dealing with people. Dealing with people. Primarily, how do we deal with people? Primarily, I think it's safe to say we talk. It's a primary way we deal with people. So, our manner of speaking, the principles we follow when speaking, are certainly critical. With that in mind, let's look then at 7 rules of lawful engagement that I have found very helpful and I am hoping could be of some benefit to you as well. And I say that based on the assumption that you are now or soon will be discussing gender identity, homosexuality, same-sex marriage, transgenderism, the experience of the intersexed, all of these things under the umbrella of sexuality and identity. I am assuming you are already, or at some time probably soon, will be discussing these issues with someone who does not hold a traditionalist viewpoint. And for that reason, we want to be equipped not only with the content, what we say, but also with certain principles to follow as we are engaging. And that brings me to my first one, very simplistic, but I think very important, and that is rule number 1, speak clearly. Speak clearly. Good heavens. We need clarity from the body of Christ on these issues. I think perhaps because we know how strongly we feel about our positions, we may mistakenly be confident that those positions are being clearly expressed. It's really not true. There's a lot of distortion going on. I think there is a lot of hesitancy among many believers to speak clearly on these issues. I think there is genuine fear of repercussion, all kinds of repercussions, even legal repercussions, much less many social repercussions. And I think on top of all of that, we are inclined to believe our own bad press. That is to say, many accusations are being made now in the world against the church. And in many cases, the church, rather than taking the time to honestly examine those accusations, is simply believing them. Well, it was on CNN, or Oprah said it, or some expert said it, so I guess it must be true. We're all jerks. We're all terrible. We're all bigoted. We've been homophobic, blah, blah, blah. And while on the one hand, I do think it is very helpful to be introspective enough to recognize, yes, in many ways we have seriously fallen short of expressing God's heart and mind accurately. Good grief, yes, that is very, very true. But that, while it is true, should not be taken as a sweeping description of the way all Christians have expressed the biblical position on homosexuality. And if we have erred, and in many cases we have, not all but many, of course the answer to error is what? Correction, not withdrawal. If I've erred, and I have, I'm not going to help anybody by simply saying, okay, I will therefore in the future shut down. That's a terrible cop-out. The responsible thing to do when one repents is to say, all right, if I have been going in the wrong direction, I'm not just going to lay down and die and go no direction, but rather I am going to go in the right direction. This is why I believe clarity is so critical, so critical. Speaking clearly. There is a growing myth that consideration prohibits clarity. Consideration prohibits clarity. In fact, while I'm soapboxing, let me soapbox on this one just for a bit. I am really concerned, and I'll bet you are too, with the growing trend towards sanctifying ambiguity, as if it is somehow more intelligent, more mature, even more godly to be perpetually ambiguous. Well, I'm not really sure. I mean, there are many different truths out there, and how can I ever be settled on anything? And of course, I expect to hear that from many non-believers, but honestly, there are a number of significantly well-known Christian leaders who seem to be boasting about their ambiguity, as if the truly godly person has a godliness which is evidenced by their refusal to take a stand on anything. And that's godliness, or at least what passes for godliness. And I believe that is a terrible, terrible disservice to the church and certainly to the world. Now, I do think there is such a thing as unnecessary, inappropriate intrusiveness. That is true. If I know someone who is openly lesbian or gay, I work with them or I deal with them or they are a family member, I feel no compulsion to remind them whenever I see them of how Paul described homosexuality in Romans 1. I think that would be irresponsible. I think it would be actually stupid and certainly counterproductive. But hey, if I've got a gay friend who says, Joe, where do you stand on same-sex marriage? Where do you stand on whether or not homosexuality is a sin? How do you determine what is right or wrong? Oh my gosh, that's an open door. That is no time for me to be vague or to be coy. And yet many today are promoting the idea that it is better to be evasive in the interest of being respectful. Well, I'm not really sure. What do you think about that? How do you feel about that? And let's try to find a respectful middle ground by which we can perpetually get it wrong. For three reasons I find this to be terribly wrong. One, and I think you'll find this true in dealing with whether it's someone who's a very aggressive gay activist or just someone who holds a pro-gay viewpoint. People don't like to be patronized. They really don't. If someone asks you a direct question, where do you stand on this? And you start going into a shuffle and a tap dance, you're basically pulling a Jack Nicholson on them. You can't handle the truth, So I'm going to be vague because somehow I think you are so fragile that your feelings are going to be hurt or you're going to get mad at me. And so since both of us must be foundationally weak, I will have to be evasive about that. And I find people feel actually more respected when you say, well, you did ask, so let me tell you plainly where I stand. And I'm not going to assume you're so weak or so fragile or so intolerant that you can't handle a different opinion. That's one reason I feel that approach is wrong. Another, biblically, grace and truth are not contradictory, are they? It's grace and truth. That's that marvelous description of Jesus in John 1:14. We beheld him, we beheld his glory as of the only begotten of the Father, full of grace and truth, not grace or truth. I look at the book of Acts, which this issue, I think, compels all of us to revisit pretty regularly. It really does. And I look at Peter's message on the day of Pentecost, Paul's sermons, Peter and John, and I think, okay, you might not have liked what those guys said, but doggone it, you'd have known what they said. You wouldn't have walked away from any of their messages uncertain as to where they stood. And I think oftentimes we forget the role of the ambassador is essential fidelity to the one who has sent her or him. That is the issue, not how well I am received, but how faithful I am to the sender. Now, that doesn't mean I'm indifferent. Far from it. If the ambassador has sent me, if I am an ambassador for Christ, what is it that I want? What Paul said so well, be reconciled to God. That's what I want. So I'm hoping that that will be the outcome of our interaction when I'm speaking with someone. But essentially, I don't determine the effectiveness of my interaction as an ambassador by whether or not I was well received, but rather by my fidelity to the one who sent me. The primary responsibility of the ambassador is to the sender, not to the recipient. Now, the recipient matters. In fact, is the recipient, especially when we are ambassadors for Christ, the recipient is a treasure. God treasures that person. We want that person to be reconciled to God. That is all true. But we don't determine whether or not we were good stewards of our commission by how we were received, but rather by how faithful we were to the sender. That, to me, is a critical point, one that I really wish we talked about more. So clarity. I find it helpful to be clear on some essential, very basic, you might even call them very juvenile points. They're so basic. That I believe we have a creator, that I believe our creator created us male or female, and there is not a curtain number 3, and that the male or female union anatomically and emotionally speaks to a very specific design. And so for that reason, I can say clearly, no, I do not believe in same-sex marriage. I not only oppose it, I simply do not believe it exists. What I oppose technically is the redefinition of marriage to include a form of union which God never intended and which God could never call a marriage. And so that is where I stand. That's a very clear statement, a relatively easy one to make. I think it's important to qualify it by saying I believe anything falling short of what the Creator intended is by definition sin, whether it is same-sex erotic contact or opposite-sex erotic contact in any form apart from the covenant of monogamous and permanent heterosexual marriage. That leaves a lot of people in the sin category, certainly, and to an extent it leaves all of us in the sin category, in that internally we do fall short, and Jesus put forth an ethic on sexuality which was almost brutal, really, in its stringency, when he said, you so much as look on someone to lust after that person, when you're not entitled to a sexual knowledge of that person, you have committed adultery of the heart. Bingo. So everyone falls short. We recognize that. That's a clear position. And therefore, since this is what I believe, then I am bound to explain this is why I believe it. I'll be talking more about this tomorrow, but essentially I believe what I believe because I believe we are created beings. I don't believe we are accidental. I don't believe we are evolved. I believe we are created. If we are created, we have a creator. If we have a creator, we answer to our creator for what we have done with our bodies. Therefore, this is how I think it should play out. I believe that people are free will agents. They have the right to make the decision, even if it is the wrong decision, but I certainly have the right to pursue what I am convinced is the right decision and choice, and to promote that option in a free society. Those are pretty simple positions, aren't they? They're not that hard to say. They're not that hard to articulate. I believe they are essentially non-threatening in that they do not rob the other person of her or his dignity, but they clarify where we stand. We should strive for clarity when a clear answer is called for. And I think it's safe to say 99.999% of the time a clear answer is called for. I realize at times Jesus spoke in parables. I realize there are parts of Scripture that are not that accessible, but basically, I think if we are stewards of truth, it shouldn't be all that hard to get the truth out of us. So clarity, very important. Rule number 2, first was speak clearly. Rule number 2, speak appropriately. Speak appropriately. It is not enough just to be clear, is it? We do have to consider the context of the conversation we are having. Now, just for example, I wonder how you'd feel if somebody said to you, hey, Paunchy, you sure look like a sack of fertilizer this morning. You're old, you're craggy, you're crusty. Why don't you just get yourself embalmed and cut to the chase? Well, you feel offended, hurt, angry? Probably. But what's funny, I didn't at all. One of my best friends said that almost verbatim to me about 2 weeks ago when we met for breakfast. I had just rolled out of bed. It was early, and candidly, I had forgotten we were going to meet for breakfast, so I didn't have time to clean up. I just went there, morning breath and morning glory. And this guy has known me for well over 30 years. And as you probably know, men are brilliant. We love each other by insulting each other. And the more we love each other, the more sadistic we get with each other. It's really smart. Like, oh, you're a jerk. Yeah, well, you're a jackass. Oh, bro. That's how we do it. I was delighted. Yeah. Now, I don't believe I know most of you personally. If I had walked in this morning and you said, "Oh, hey, Paunchy, you sure look old and decrepit and saggy and baggy, and why don't you just get yourself embalmed and cut to the chase?" See, you just said the same thing one of my best friends said. What's the difference? Of course, context. Context, it has to do with everything, doesn't it? I mean, every time we have a conversation, there's content, what we say, and there is context, the context of the relationship. Which I'm sure is why a Samaritan woman was so blown away when a Hebrew male comes up to her to interact about something as basic as water. Could I please have some water from you? So of course she said, "Oh, you talking to me? How is it that you, a Hebrew man, are even speaking with a Samaritan female? You're crossing gender lines, you're crossing racial lines." The context of the situation, I think, was very disarming. In my opinion, his willingness to cross those lines is part of what softened her and brought her to the point where she was able to receive what she had to say. And look what happened. I mean, not only was a woman given life, but she, in essence, evangelized a whole village. Speaking appropriately then. Very important considering the context of the relationship. Just because something is true, you may hold to it as an absolute truth, does not mean it's appropriate to say it at a given time. Context has to be considered. Of course it does. I often compare this subject to the doctrine of hell, my least favorite subject in all of the Bible. I hate the thought of it. I would love to revise that. If there was anything in Scripture I would like to tinker with, it would be the doctrine of hell. I loathe the idea of an agonized eternal separation from God. I loathe it, and I loathe the descriptions of it that I read in the Bible, none of which entitles me to rewrite the Bible. It just causes me to realize I hate the thought of that. It's a hard doctrine. I certainly wouldn't bring it up casually. So if I'm working in an office and a coworker says we have this file to complete before noon, no, I would not say, well, let's do it because you may have a heart attack, die, and burn in hell forever, which is where you are headed. I'd rather get the file done before you're on fire. Of course not. Obviously inappropriate. Obviously inappropriate. The question I have to ask before bringing up such a subject is it relevant? Is it even relevant to this discussion? Secondly, do I have the right? By what authority may I speak into this person's life? Very important about something so personal. And third, if it is relevant and I have the right, is this the time? Is this the time? Now, if someone I loved, knew, was related to, interacted with regularly, or even a stranger who was clearly open to discussing it came to me and said, where do you stand on these issues? Yes, I think it's relevant. Sure I do. And I think I have the right because that person either has made it clear he wants to hear my answer, or I am entitled because of the nature of the relationship I have with this person. And that's definitely, I think, the right time when somebody says, where do you stand on this? I wouldn't say, let me get back to you. I'd say, let's talk about it right now. Let's talk about it right now. So, relevance, prerogative, and timing. My lovely wife and I were having breakfast just a couple of mornings ago at a restaurant, and the server was very, very overtly either lesbian or transgender or possibly both, I don't know. And one of the nicest, politest, friendliest, enjoyable people you could meet. No, I didn't feel any compunction to say, there's a conference in a couple of days. I'd love to see you there. It looks like you could use it. No. I don't feel I had the right to do that. I think if we had conversed more and she had brought up, so what are you doing here in San Diego? What brings you here? Or, that type of a thing, maybe an open door. But just in the context of the very brief interaction we were having, I really did not feel at all that it would have been appropriate to try to open that door. My wife did make it a point when we finished to say, thank you so much for making our day. You're terrific and you're very friendly, and it just was a nice lift having you as the person doing this for us. And I think that was just right where it belonged. So you, of course, want to be speaking appropriately. You do want to be speaking clearly. You want to be looking at the appropriateness of it. Is it relevant at this time? Do I have the prerogative to speak it? And is this the right timing? That's speaking appropriately. Third, speaking empathically. Speaking empathically. You remember Paul told the Romans 12:15, rejoice with those who rejoice, weep with those who weep. Feel with people. Feel with people. Critical part of effective intimacy and relationship building is empathy. In fact, one of the first supervisors I had when I was in training for a degree in counseling, I'm a pastoral counselor. I'm not a licensed professional psychologist or psychotherapist, just a biblical counselor. But my first supervisor said more than half the battle is going to be empathy. If you can communicate to people that you can find common ground based on common experience, you can feel with them, and you are a safe person to talk to, you've already really developed a very fertile ground for some good fruit to come. Empathy, then, feeling with another person. Now, more often than not, empathy is imperfect and it's very limited, isn't it? I certainly felt empathy for my wife when she was in labor, but it was not a very intelligent empathy. In that moment, I never would have been stupid enough to say, honey, I know just what you're going through. You'd lose an arm saying a thing like that. But I understand pain. I get that, at least. I understand pain for the sake of something good. I get that. So to a point, I can find some limited empathy. And the best I could do was basically be there. It cracks me up, those classes they put you through. Not that this has anything to do with what we're talking about, but I mean, come on. Breathe. Oh, thank you, Joe. What would I do without you? I'll breathe. That's a great idea. Okay. Boy, are you a lifesaver? Yeah, that's what they teach you to do. You useful husband, you tell her to breathe. Yeah, great. Speak empathically. Speak empathically. Finding some commonality. Empathy is not always the primary issue. I know that too. I remember speaking at a conference, and a young man came stomping down the aisle, coming up to me saying, you ought to be ashamed of yourself. Jesus never judged anybody. You just judged gays and lesbians. You're a Pharisee. You're a terrible person, and people kill themselves because of you. I really don't think it would have been appropriate to say, well, I really feel your pain. Gee, I think at that time it was appropriate to say, I'm not fully sure where you're coming from, but I know an ordinary tantrum when I see one. And I think you'd find yourself a lot more effective with people if you took a more mature approach to people. And I really think in that case, though that was not an empathic thing to say, I think it was the right thing to say. I think it was the right thing to say. So empathy is not always the primary issue, but more often than not, it's critical to communication. If someone you love, and this is especially true if this is the case, someone you love, you're in a close relationship with, has come out to you and said, I'm lesbian, I'm gay, I'm trans, I'm bi, I'm whatever, same-sex attracted. I think listening and questioning can be terrific vehicles for getting a very redemptive dialogue going. Now, I find most of us, when we're emotionally invested in someone, we tend to react verbally immediately. What do you mean? That can't be true. Oh, no, but I think if we can consider the fact that we want this to go somewhere, I think it can be very important to basically say, okay, this is really throwing me for a loop. This is very hard for me. You know I love you. You know where I stand. And to be honest with you, my world just got turned upside down. It really did. But help me understand. What has this been like for you? What has this been like for you? It's a very respectful question. It's not a compromise. If I ask what it's been like for you, I'm not for a minute insinuating that you've made the right decision to embrace this. I'm only saying I would like to better understand your journey. What has this been like for you? Where do you stand now? You've told me you're gay, you've told me you're lesbian. Well, that actually raises more questions than it answers. Are you in a relationship? Have you abandoned any spiritual perspective on this? What are your intentions? Are you going to be open about it? Or do you see this as something you want to resist and not yield to? What's your position? That's a very relevant question, a very respectful question. And a question that I think opens up a lot, it can open up a lot by way of heart and opportunity and good conversation. What do you want from me? When you told me this, what were you expecting? What would you like from me? I'm not saying I can necessarily respond exactly as you want me to, but it does matter to me what you're wanting from me. You want me to hear you? Are you wanting me to validate you? Are you wanting me to commit to staying in relationship with you regardless? What are you wanting from me? That's all part of a very empathic response to the individual. When I repented back in early 1984, I had a lot of old friends who could not, I do not believe, relate very well to where I had been. I had been born again at the age of 16. I had been sexually active with both men and women for years prior to that. I married when I was very young. I committed adultery routinely when I was 23, and again in relations with both sexes. My wife, biblically, with biblical grounds, did divorce me, and I feel she did no wrong in that. I gave myself completely over. I was a part of the gay community and then on staff with the gay church, and then this was after having been in full-time ministry as a very young man. At age 29, I repented. I'm 62 now. At age 29, I realized as God interrupted my life, convicted me relentlessly, softened my heart, I have been wrong. I went back into the body of Christ. I started interacting with many of my old friends who had known me 7 years earlier when I had walked away. And I don't for a minute think they understood homosexuality. Candidly, I do not think they could spell homosexuality. I certainly don't think they understood the dynamics of it. But what they conveyed to me so beautifully without articulating it was, okay, Joe, we have a struggle between the flesh and the spirit because we're born-again believers. We have been given a new nature. It wrestles with our old nature. We assume you also have an old nature and a new nature, and they are at war with each other. We get that. We expect you not to yield to the flesh. You expect us not to yield to the flesh. We will understand some of your temptations. Sometimes you want to swear. Sometimes you want to lie. Sometimes you want to just be a complete ass about everything. And so do we. And some of your temptations we don't understand at all, and some of our temptations you don't understand at all. But we get it. We understand what it is to be a human Christian male attempting to live a godly life in very ungodly times. Now, if you can understand what it is to be human attempting to live a sanctified life in very unsanctified times, well, you've really got a lot of the basic equipment to deal with somebody struggling with same-sex issues. You really do. Because one doesn't need a perfect first-hand understanding of someone else's struggle to be of real benefit to someone in their struggle. So, speaking empathically, very, very important part of our communication. We meet people on that common ground of human limitation and human pain and human need. And I think every human can understand what it's like to have feelings she or he wishes she or he did not have. And to say no to things that seem so desirable that it feels like suicide to say no to them. Now, I think we all get that. We all get that. For you, that may have been one thing. For me, it may have been something else. But I think we get it. And I think out of that empathy, we can connect very deeply. Very deeply. Rule 4 has to do with concession. Concede what's true. Concede what's true. That is to say, when you identify yourself as a born-again Christian, a follower of Jesus Christ, who sees the Bible as the ultimate written authority by which God has communicated both his nature and his intentions to his people, you are quite likely to hear a number of accusations. Oh, you people have been so insensitive. Oh, you people have called us all pedophiles. Oh, you people said we all deserved AIDS. It was the judgment of God. Oh, you people have so much of a problem with porn use and adultery and a high divorce rate in your own ranks, and you point the finger at us. And I don't find it very useful to deny any of that. I find it a lot more useful to concede what's true, which seems anathema to our current social and political climate, doesn't it? I swear, not to go where we really shouldn't go in a meeting like this, but it really seems to me like in our current political and social climate, humility is a crime. I mean, it's just a crime. You mustn't be humble. You dig in your heels, you defend your position. I don't care how stupid it is, and I point no fingers at the left or the right on this. I think it's a universal sin. Full disclosure, I happen to be politically and socially extremely conservative. Not that that means anything, but what I do find on both sides, I really do find this across the board, is the idea that my position must be defended no matter what, and every criticism leveled at me or those who hold my position has to be deflected even if it's true, because winning is what matters, not honesty. And in marriage counseling, if you've worked with couples, you know that that's one of the biggest frustrations of marriage counseling, is when a couple comes in made of two people and each of them wants to win their case, you ain't going to get anywhere. Because you're the judge, and there's a plaintiff and there's a defendant. They're not wanting to work together. They're each wanting to win the case. And so it is in discussions like this. I find it very helpful to concede what's true. Now, considering a wrong is not the same as compromising a position. Considering a wrong is not the same as compromising our position. I make no apologies for a traditional Judeo-Christian position on human sexuality, none whatsoever. But I am sorry for the way many people have held that position. I think it is inarguable that homosexual people have traditionally experienced cruel mistreatment in our nation. I do not believe that has been true of every society, every culture, every time in history. But I think those of you who are anywhere near my age or up will remember very clearly a time in American life when it was perfectly acceptable to call a homosexual person by any derogatory name, beat them up, look on them with contempt, mark them as the butt of jokes, and in essence, single them out for terrible treatment. Now, that is true. It's inarguable. Yes, homosexual people have been mistreated. I dare say it is true that in many cases, homosexual people have been very mistreated, even by people who were born-again believers, even at times leaders of congregations or broad-based ministries, leaders who should have known better. I remember with great clarity, and to this day, real pain, the day I walked into church 2 days after I repented, and for the first time in years walked back into a solid, conservative, Bible-believing church. And I was so happy to feel like, oh, I'm home again. There's the safety of this sanctuary where God's word is taught, and I'm going to be built up again. And the pastor began the sermon, I kid you not, describing a gay rights bill that the governor of California at that time was considering. And the pastor very calmly and plainly said to the congregation, homosexuals want you to think they're not child molesters, but that's not true. I know they are. Because they used to try to molest me when I was a boy, and I'd beat them up, and the whole congregation broke out into applause. And then he said, and if they ever beat my or touch my grandchildren, I'll beat them up again. And the whole congregation broke out into loud applause. And I thought, if these people knew where I have been, they would assume that I have been out molesting children. There's no describing the alienation and even the anguish that goes along with that. So absolutely, we can concede where we've been wrong. But I think we can concede the wrongness of the way people have held a position without denigrating, much less discarding the position itself. My goodness, in colonial times, if you missed church fellowship and you didn't have a good reason, like you died or something, well, you might find yourself put in the stocks. You shoot your big mouth off. If it's found out, you could be tied to a stool and swung out over the ice-cold lake and held underwater for more than a minute while the whole town stood around and laughed at you. Was there anything wrong with the positions the church held, that you shouldn't miss church fellowship, that you shouldn't gossip? No, there was nothing at all wrong with that. I would really challenge the wisdom of the way that they were expressing or enforcing those positions, but not the positions itself. And I think that's where we can get people on track and saying, yes, many people have held this position the wrong way, but does the fact somebody held a position the wrong way invalidate the position itself, or does it simply invalidate the means by which they have held the position? And this is a real concern to me even as we speak. Our culture is on the precipice of flushing sacred traditions, primarily because in many cases the positions have been held the wrong way, rather than taking the time to examine whether or not the positions themselves might still have validity. And this, I believe, is a terrible mistake. A terrible mistake. 3 more rules. Rule number 5, after we have hopefully conceded what is generally true, we can also consider what is possible. Consider what is possible. Now, good rule of thumb I like to go by, because I believe that the Scripture, both Old and New Testaments, are inspired by God and they are the final authority in matters of life and conduct. Okay, where the Bible's adamant, let's be adamant. No wiggle room. Where it's adamant. I know some of it we can argue. It's subject to, well, we're just limited. But in most of it is pretty clear stuff. We can be adamant where it's adamant. The Bible says any number of sexual behaviors fall short of what God intended, therefore they are sins, case closed. That I can be adamant about. Now, when it comes to what internal dynamics come together to create a propensity for certain things, I'm open. Because in that, I think we are talking about the mystery of the flesh. And the flesh is nothing if not mysterious. It's fascinating and scary to consider what we are capable of doing to each other. I mean, really. I think it's safe to say World War II could be called recent history in the scheme of things. We have seen what we are capable of doing to each other. So yes, the flesh is mysterious. The flesh is mysterious. And I don't think recognizing that in any way denigrates or dismantles our positions. So, for example, in 1991, a number of studies, primarily those released by Dr. Simon LeVay of the Salk Institute in La Jolla, Drs. Pollard and Bailey, a psychiatrist and psychologist respectively, Dr. Dean Hamer, a geneticist, indicated that perhaps homosexuality is an inborn condition. And immediately, I felt many believers were defensively saying, no, it's not, that can't be true, that's all bogus, not on your life. Well, I'm still not convinced that homosexuality is an inborn condition. I still have not seen any results conclusive enough that to me say once and for all, yeah, the case is closed, because it really isn't. And I think the most honest scientists and psychologists and doctors involved are admitting that really what causes sexual orientation is probably a set of very complex issues coming together. Some of them relational, some of them internal, some of them subconscious, some of them perhaps even physical. I don't think we're ever going to find a gay gene, but all of that said, I can consider the possibility that certain tendencies may be inborn. And that leads me to say, but let's cut to the chase. Do we determine whether something is healthy or unhealthy by what created it, or do we judge it by a different standard? I mean, after all, there are any number of tendencies which really may have genetic or biological roots. Chemical dependency, depression, violence. Shoot, a few years back, Time magazine ran a cover story, I love it. It said, adultery, it may be in our genes. And the author was insinuating that perhaps males were genetically programmed towards promiscuity or polygamy rather than monogamy. And really, I don't believe any of those necessarily have been conclusively proven, but all they would indicate to me is what we already know. We are a fallen race. And when humanity fell, when God pronounced what is often called the curse, he in essence said the human experience will now include many things I never meant you to experience. So I can concede what is possible. Yes, it's possible that there may be inborn elements contributing to homosexuality. Yes, I definitely think it's possible that a lesbian woman or a gay man can be a perfectly lovable, respectful, and likable individual. I think it's entirely possible that two people of the same sex may, yes, genuinely love each other very much. I think it is entirely possible that a person who is homosexual may in many ways be an extremely high-functioning individual who is contributing wonderful things to all of our lives. Doesn't change my position at all. But I can consider all of those possibilities, and I find it much more respectful to do so. I find it enhances communication all the more. But we consider what is possible. Rule 6, let's keep this one in mind, especially if you do much public speaking. Let's watch the apologies. Let's watch the apologies. I am sorry for every time any Christian person has said something irresponsible about or to homosexual people. I am not willing to say that Christians should stop speaking on this issue because some have spoken irresponsibly. Nor am I willing to accept every accusation a person makes against a believer. The fact that somebody says, Reverend so-and-so said a mean thing to me, does not convince me automatically that Reverend so-and-so said such a mean thing. I think all of these things need to be tested and true, but I will certainly be willing to apologize for what I know to be true and wrong, whether it's something I've done or something I hear somebody else has done. But no, I'm not going to accept for a minute the words that are going through the echo chamber as we speak, and they are. Christians are homophobic and racist. They are all bigots hiding behind religious liberty. They do damage to lesbians and gays because of the positions they hold. No. Many years ago, when I was very young, the terrific apologist Josh McDowell wrote a book, Evidence That Demands a Verdict. I think it's time for someone to write a book called Verdict, which demands some evidence. A verdict has been passed in America without evidence. We have been found guilty without any solid evidence proving that we are all guilty of what we have been charged with. And finally, Rule 7, recognize and point out diversions when they're presented to you. Recognize and point out diversions. That is to say, at times when someone is presenting themselves as wanting an honest discussion with you, What they are really hoping to do is discredit you through diversion. So, for example, Jesus would be teaching to the crowd, and a Pharisee or a scribe would come up and say, "Hey, is it lawful to pay taxes to Caesar?" Trick question. If you say yes, well, everybody's mad at Rome for the power they're wielding over the Hebrews, so you'll lose the Hebrews. If you say no, then you're going to be charged with challenging Roman authority. It's a diversion tactic. And I think there is a place for pointing out this seems to be a diversion. Just for example, if someone were to say to me, "You believe that homosexuality falls short of what God intended." Well, what about people who are born with both sets of genitals? Well, I think that's an interesting question. I'm not at all sure how it's relevant to our discussion of homosexuality. People who are intersex have a physical condition, and thereby I think that is an attempt to divert from what we are really attempting to talk about here. It is common for you to experience diversion tactics, and when they come, I think there is a place for saying, "You seem to be wanting to get us off track, or you seem to be more interested in attacking me than having a dialogue with me, or that sure looks like a red herring thrown into the conversation to distract us from the direction we were going." And I think there is a place for pointing that out and saying, can we get back to the discussion at hand? I know that when you and I function as stewards of truth, one of the first things we must be made aware of are our limitations. I never feel so limited personally as when I am talking and realize I'm just talking. I can't soften anybody's heart. I can't convict anybody of sin. I can't make faith rise within another person. I can't make another person hungry for God. I'm just flapping away my silly mouth. And that's when I realize if we are commissioned as stewards of truth, we enter into a cooperative effort God has established between God and humanity. Not because God needs us, but because God has condescended to allow us to be part of what he wishes to do in the lives of other people. Thereby, I take James very seriously and gratefully when he said, James 1:5, "Any of you lack wisdom, ask for it, God will give it liberally." I thank God for what Paul said to the Philippians. It is God who works in you both to will and to do of his good pleasure, because that reminds me when I'm talking to someone, God is working in that person. I want to be in concert with God so that he will take my words and do what I am incapable of doing. God is at work in that individual, and I want to be a part of what God is doing in that individual. And I know if I am asking for wisdom, which I am promised, and if I am asking to be a part of what God wishes to do in that individual, then I can very much take to heart what John said. This is the confidence we have in him. We ask anything according to his will. He hears us, and we have the petitions that we desire of him. If you and I present ourselves as stewards of truth, and if we will dare to trust him to follow through by doing the work we cannot do, and if we will also dare to obey him by doing the work we have been commissioned to do, then I feel when all is said and done, we will be able to hear him say, "Well done, good faithful servants." Thank you very much. Let's break for lunch.